Hi there. I'm giving this type of recording a shot. I've never actually recorded something using PowerPoint recording or whatever they call this thing, the slideshow. Anyway, it'll be interesting to see how it turns out, and hopefully it turns out well. But I'd like to thank the people from B-Sides Athens for having me supposedly keynote, although, maybe next year I'll be there live, which I'm looking forward to. Anyway, let's talk about this presentation. Um, for lack of a better term, this presentation, I shouldn't say it came about because of this, but it's iconic. The first time I was going to give a presentation of this nature, I was actually speaking at CornCon, which is kind of, for lack of a better term, B-Sides, Iowa. And it was in Davenport, Iowa. Flew there, and anyway, I was talking. I got there right before my session, which was going to be after lunch, but I had a chance to be there at lunch. And I was on the buffet line, and what happened was somebody in front of me, he saw a table next to the buffet line, and the table was giving out stickers, and the stickers essentially said, don't click on SH asterisk T. So I'll just say, don't click on quote unquote stuff. So anyway, the guy looks over at it, and he's your typical system admin type, and he goes, oh, I need a lot of these stickers. I go, really? He's like, yeah, I got a lot of users that click on stuff. And I'm like, they do? He's like, yeah. I'm like, well, you must give your users a lot of stuff to click on then. He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, how can they click on stuff if they don't have stuff to click on? I mean, they're using your computers, aren't they? It's like, yeah, they're using your servers, they're using your email. It's like you're giving them all the stuff to click on. And I go, by the way, if you know they're going to click on stuff, what are you doing to stop the results of the clicking on stuff? He's like, well, what do you, I'm like, I go, let's face it, users can't click on quote unquote stuff unless there is stuff to click on. And the only way the users have stuff to click on is if you give it to them. And then, as important, you enable them to essentially create the damage that you actually care that they click on stuff. So hopefully you see, like a lot of people, they see this title and they're like, oh my God, another presentation that, insults the user. For lack of a better term, I'm not here to insult the user. This is more an insult to the profession because frankly, and I'm going to come back to this as a critical point, right now, users are considered 90% of the problem. Users attacks and everything, and then it's like the result is, oh, let's create, let's make the user the human firewall. Let's make them the last line of defense and all that other crap. The reality of the situation is that we're looking at this problem in the wrong way. And we need to stop looking at the user problem as a problem resulting and centered on the user. And I'll talk about this later. I don't want to go through the whole presentation right now on the first slide, so I'll give you something more to work with. So before we actually talk about what creates the problem, let's look at the definition of what is stupid. And I realize you're all, a lot of people there are from Greece, although now that it's being able to be viewed from all over the world, generally, whether it's in English or whatever language you want, look at the concept of stupid. Stupid is defined as having or showing a great lack of intelligence or common sense. And generally when we talk about hiring stupid users and all that sort of stuff, again, what are we talking about? We're saying, okay, stupid is these people are just no common sense. Okay, let's break that down a little bit though. Let me ask you this question. Do you hire people with a great lack of intelligence? In other words, are you looking to hire stupid people? And if you do have somebody who is really showing a great lack of intelligence, whose fault is it for hiring them in the first place? Why do you put somebody with limited intelligence in a position of responsibility where they can click on something and ruin your network? Again, whose fault would it be, even if a user actually is stupid, for them to be in the position to cause your network harm? Now, let's take this a little bit further. Do you hire people with a great lack of common sense? In other words, are you hiring, like people aren't necessarily lacking of intelligence, but they don't have general common sense. From my background is in psychology, and from my psychology days, you can't have common sense without common knowledge. And if people don't have common sense, it means you're not providing them with common knowledge. Did you provide people with training so that they can have the common knowledge to exercise common sense? And again, it's common sense that a user will fail. And if a user fails, did you expect the failing? That's common sense. So again, the problem is it's common knowledge that people will eventually fail. So again, if you're not accounting for this, you're the one who is quote unquote technically stupid, which again is leading to this slide. If you are calling your users stupid, who's really the stupid one? The users or the people who are putting them in this position knowing that they're eventually going to be stupid? So let's take a step back though. As I mentioned, at the end of the day, it's not really you. I'm not calling you stupid. I guess now I'm calling security awareness people stupid, but not even them. The problem is we've been trained to look at the user problem, and I'm going to refer to it as the user problem, as being centered on the user themselves. We've been fed a whole bunch of crap. We hear terms like the human firewall. We hear your users are the first line of defense, the last line of defense. There's a lot of, I don't know how many people work out and know the concept of what's called bro science. It's like the bros in the gym always say, oh, eat more protein, bro, do more cardio, bro, whatever it is. But we have the same type of bro science, as I would call it, in the security awareness profession. People take a book, they take some research, they're like, oh, this sounds right. Let's talk psychology, for example. When we talk psychology, it's like psychology. The problem with psychology is that it's the individual person that you're focusing on. And that sounds noble. That sounds great. The reality, though, is you can't go ahead and generate an awareness program for each and every individual in your organization. You have to look at things like organizational psychology, sociology, where you're actually looking at the organization as a whole and basically saying, my job as an awareness professional to reduce the overall risk of the organization. And I need to focus on what are the best ways to move the organization in the right direction, as opposed to how do I move each and every individual in the right direction. And because think of it this way, if you have an organization with 1,000 people, are you going to be able to actually influence each and every individual person within the organization? No. But if you look at all the other sciences that are out there, you look at the other disciplines that are out there, they're able to do something useful. And the reason why most awareness people and security people aren't being as useful as those other professions is because we're being fed the wrong type of information. We're being fed, oh, focus on the individual and make the user. That's not the way it works in any other discipline. It's not the way it should work with you here. Because here's the fundamental problem. People are focusing on the proximity of the error. They're saying the user clicked on something, so therefore we need a better user, we need a smarter user, and so on. And that's just wrong. I'll talk about that a little bit, but it's the analogy. Like again, the analogy, if we're saying, like in the cybersecurity world, is if a canary dies in a coal mine, the solution is a healthier canary. That is fundamental, flat out wrong. If a user fails, the user is essentially our canary in the coal mine. The user is our canary of our overall architecture, our overall security infrastructure. Because if a user fails, the user has been put in a position where they can fail. The user has then been like, what caused the user, for lack of a better term, to fail? Why did the canary die? And then, okay, so user fails. What are we doing after the user fails to stop the damage from being realized? And I'll go through that in a bit. So anyway, I don't know how many people around the world are going to recognize this guy, but if you've ever seen the show Seinfeld, this is Newman. And actually, Newman and Seinfeld really has nothing to do with this. I just needed some funny depiction for accounting. And when you stop and consider accounting, think of it this way. If you're inside a large organization, what happens if you don't fill out your time card properly? You don't fill out your time card properly, you're not going to get paid if that's the rule of the organization. If you go on a trip and you travel, take an airplane flight, and you go ahead and your policy says in order to be reimbursed, you need to have the appropriate receipts. So yes, if you go ahead and you don't submit receipts, you're not going to get reimbursed. And what happens in most organizations? You could, for example, buy a $1,000 plane ticket. You can then spend $2,000, or let's use euros. You can spend 1,000 euros on a plane ticket, 2,000 euros on a hotel. Then you could spend another 500 euros on food. And then if you don't hand in, like when I travel, if I don't hand in my €5 receipt for my Starbucks Frappuccino, I am not going to get reimbursed for everything. They send back the entire expense report saying you need the one receipt. Why do they do that? They frankly do this because this is the process. This is the way they enforce it. And think about it this way. Me handing in the receipt is essentially, their fraud protection for their whole accounting process. And what they have learned is people, frankly, not that they don't distrust everyone, but they have learned that there is the potential for fraud in submitting expense reports. So therefore, they have implemented the appropriate processes, the appropriate accounting procedures. And it's annoying. They lay out these in advance. They tell you what you have to do. You do it. If you don't do it, you don't get reimbursed. That's unfortunately the case. That's their mechanism. If a user ruins the network, on the other hand, what happens? User ruins the network. They're like, oh, please don't do that again. Frankly, I would rather have an organization reimburse me an extra €5 for my Frappuccino than suffer a $750 million incident because their network was taken down because somebody clicked on the wrong link. So anyway, consider that. That's accounting. There's also another analogy I like to use, scuba diving. I happen to be a master scuba diver trainer. And when I train people, the first time I ever heard the expression, you can't, C-A-N-T, cannot stop stupid, was when I was taking my scuba instruction. The scuba diver trainer, the course director as he's known, came in and was telling us, you can't stop stupid. And I'm like sitting there thinking, you know what? We're sitting here and our job is essentially as scuba instructors to stop stupid. What are we doing as instructors? I mean, I don't know how many of you in the audience are scuba certified. If you are, that's awesome. If you're not, get certified. It's awesome. But, before you go ahead, and assuming you take an appropriate course, there are dive certification bodies. I'm an instructor in the Professional Association of Dive Instructors, PADI. There's other ones like SSI and a few others. Anyway, all these people have established standards. And before you go ahead and take dive instruction, first thing you need to do is take coursework. The coursework is essentially how not to get yourself killed. In other words, how not to do stupid things. Then you're supposed to get in the water. Before you get in the water, you have to have your health form filled out, which is to stop you, obviously, from injuring yourself. That's obviously critical. Then after that, they want you to do a swimming test. It's a general, it's not that you actually are a good swimmer. They just want to make sure primarily you don't freak out in water after a few minutes. So, you basically have to swim, I forgot, like 300 meters, 300 yards. You have to tread water for about 10 minutes or whatever it happens to be. And again, that's just to show you're comfortable and not going to kill yourself. Then finally, they put you in equipment. They go ahead, lay it out, tell you how to put it together. As an instructor, I'm supposed to make sure you put it together properly. Then you get in the water in like 3 feet of water where you're not going to be able to drown yourself even if you wanted to. Well, I guess if you really wanted to, you'd find a way. But even in they put you in 3 feet of water. Then as everybody gets comfortable, they slowly bring you out, give you the basic skills. Then when it comes time to be certified, they give you tests once again to make sure you know the material. Then you go in the water as an instructor, and this is what the graphic is. You're sitting there and you're supposed to go down on a platform in very calm water, and essentially, usually the water is not supposed to be below 10 meters deep. More frequently it's about 5 meters deep, again, where it's very hard to cause harm. And as an instructor, I'm supposed to go one student at a time and certify people. I have regulations that before I put people in the water, I check everybody's equipment. I have to make sure that all the environment is safe. I have to know how to call an ambulance. I have to know where the hyperbaric chamber is, the closest one. I have to be able to have a first aid kit, have oxygen. The facility we're at also has insurance. I have insurance. The dive school has insurance. It's a whole bunch of one risk mitigation after another, from putting people in the water slowly and everything. And one thing I want to point out is, obviously, if I'm the instructor here, and I don't know if my cursor is actually pointing there, but if I'm the instructor here, I'm essentially supposed to do one student at a time. And the big thing is, in the back upper right-hand corner, it's hard to see, but there's somebody hovering there. That, I'm assuming based on the picture, is an assistant instructor or a dive master. When I take students in the water to certify them, if I have more than two, I always want to bring somebody there in, because you always know a student might do something quote unquote stupid, despite whatever you tell them, despite the best training. There was one time, for example, I was in the process of certifying people, and having them demonstrate the water skills one at a time. And I looked at the corner of my eye, and there was this one guy ready to crawl under the deck. And I'm like, sitting there thinking, I told everybody never to do that, because you could actually get wedged in there if you don't know what you're doing, with your equipment getting caught. And so I started having to go over. Luckily, the dive master working with me saw this, and he was able to stop him too. But people are going to do that. But again, everything is about risk mitigation from start to finish. So another one that's critical is safety science. And I'm telling you all these practical implementations of how people and other environments stop quote unquote stupid. Safety science is a very well-defined business discipline. And safety science, it looks for what happens if somebody gets injured in the workplace. Obviously that costs people money. There's, besides of the insurance rates, if somebody gets injured on a manufacturing environment, it could shut down the manufacturing for an unlimited period of time, depending on what's going on. So what you're doing is, safety science has learned, there's old school safety science. Old school safety science was about the user. Why did the user do something stupid? New school safety science is, again, for lack of a better term, essentially, the user is just a part of a system. That's all the user is. That if a user injures themselves, in some way, the system put them in the place to cause injury, and then somehow the system let the injury be realized. And how did the system work to mitigate the injury or stop death or damage as best as possible? So when people in safety science, they stop, they look at all enabling factors, they look at the user as just the proximity of the error, and the proximity is just the symptom. If a user is somehow able to injure themselves, that user is not the problem. That injury is the symptom of the overall problem. And that's what's most critical. And we don't look at it in the same way that other professions do. And let's start talking about, the unfortunate case of the MAX 737 jets. I don't know how many people remember that now, but we really should take a hard look at this. I mean, it's really critical to do it. So anyway, the whole thing about safety silence, pet error, and all that sort of stuff. When the 737 MAX jets crashed, I believe it was Lion Air, and I forgot the name of the other aircraft that crashed, or the other airline. But what happened was, initially everybody said, oh, The pilots, the plane went into the ground. Clearly, it's pilot error. And it's like, was it really pilot error when they started doing the studies and everything? The answer, let's take a step back. Could the pilots have saved the planes? The answer is actually yes. The pilots could have saved the planes. But there were so many other issues that put the pilots in damage. Because in the first place, where did this problem initiate? The problem initiated years before in changing the planes, because the 737 MAX jets are almost, well, I shouldn't say almost identical. They are significantly the same as the other 737 jets, like the 737-300, 300, 700, 900, whatever the case is. And, the airlines and everybody thought, okay, they're basically the same. However, the reality was they were different. The plane engines were moved a little bit forward, which affected the balance of the planes, which you might say, oh, no big deal. It actually, if you're not telling people the right things, it is a bigger deal. Then there's also, in the design of software, there are these things called angle of attacks, AOAs. And these are sensors on the side of planes. There are two of them. Now, somewhere along the way, early in the software design phase, somebody went ahead and said, hey, we used to have it that if one thing said it was going down and the other thing said it was going up, one angle of attack was going down, one was going up, we used to alert the pilots that there was a problem here, that there was a disagreement, or we defaulted to the one that said, one thing. Now what happened was the software was redesigned, frankly, not to let the pilots know that there was a disagreement between the plane apparently going up and the plane apparently going down. That's number one. Then there were a whole other concerns about keeping the plane stable. What happened, however, was that the pilots were never trained on the differences. The pilots were never told, oh, this could happen if the sensors were conflicting, that the plane would automatically steer itself down because it thought the plane was going down. And I know this might sound complicated if you're not a pilot. The way a plane goes up is you pick up speed, and the way you pick up speed is by angling the plane down. So if the plane's going down, it angled the plane harder down, or at least if the plane thought it was going down, it angled the plane going down even faster. And that's obviously a problem. That's actually the way it should work, but unfortunately, the plane was not adjusting, and the autopilot was confusing the issue. Sorry, I realize I'm making a very complicated issue. Hopefully I'm making it less complicated, but hopefully you followed along. And what happened then was that all of a sudden, the pilots were fighting the autopilot. And then at some point, the pilot would turn off the autopilot and they got control of the plane. Then when they turned the autopilot back on, which nobody said not to do, the plane angled itself again, and they were again fighting the planes. But why did the pilots make the error? They were not trained properly. The design of the planes happened, and yes, if the pilots reacted perfectly, yes, the pilots could have theoretically saved the plane, but it's not likely. And I'm going a lot into this because your users are essentially the pilots of the 737 MAX jets. You're putting them in positions where without giving them the appropriate information. Now, when you look at where does the blame actually fall? Going back to safety science, what they found was that when they looked at a user error, they found 90% of the time the user error was the fault of the environment, not the users themselves. So, for example, what's a user environment? If somebody injures themselves, for example, could it be that there wasn't the appropriate warning? If it could be that, for example, that a piece of equipment fell on them because the environment wasn't set up properly. It could be, and I'll give you one case where there was one time where I was working with a factory environment, setting up their awareness program. I spoke to the safety person. The safety person said, well, we had a lot of problems where people were being injured because forklifts were driving down the warehouse and they were either people were walking into them or the forklift ran into somebody else. And what we decided to do was we went through all these different options. We just decided, let's paint a line down our warehouse factory floors. And they said, okay, now People are to stay to one side, forklifts stay to the other. It sounds really simple, sounds really like you would have thought they would have done this, they don't need it, but it stopped approximately 90% of all injuries. And then when you look at what were the other 10% of injuries, I'll go to the next slide. Generally, it was carelessness, ignorance. Somebody said, oh, they didn't know which side was which. Some people were on their iPhones, whether it was the driver, whether it was the person walking, the driver or the person walking into the forklift or whatever. Now, the other 10%, and I'm not saying people drive into somebody intentionally, but in other environments, for example, computer environments, we talk about empowering the users, making the human firewall. What happens if the user actually has malice? And people forget about that. But anyway, this other 10%, I'll come back to malice. But let's face it this way. Statistically, 3% of the population worldwide are sociopaths or psychopaths. 3%. That means these 3% of people will do you harm if given the opportunity. So again, remember that. Malice is also something we have to address because the user might make a mistake or cause harm intentionally, and your awareness is going to do nothing. But generally, even that 10% is where your awareness program is going to fit in and do damage. 90% of your awareness or 90% of the problem will not be well addressed by awareness. But again, it's still only 10% of the problem. Now, the reality is awareness is only 20% of the 10%. Here's something from applied behavioral science. Anyway, antecedent, which is essentially information. Information, you're hoping, is the awareness program, and you're supposed to essentially create awareness, and awareness will impact a behavior. A behavior, however, creates a consequence. Now, any behavior creates a consequence. The consequence could be good, bad, or neutral. So, for example, you tell a user, I don't want you to reuse a password because reusing a password is bad. And then what happens is the user sits there and says, yeah, but I don't want to remember a new password. I kind of hear what you're saying, but I don't want to do it. So I'm going to not follow your advice. I'm going to reuse my password in my work account as I would for my YouTube account, as an example. So anyway, the user does this. What is the consequence for the user reusing their password? The consequence for a user reusing their business password on their personal account is actually a positive consequence. The user is being reinforced to do something bad. Why is that? Because the user has one less password to remember. And if the password is not otherwise compromised, which does happen, and the user is not held accountable for that, the user has no reason to follow your advice. So again, there's the consequence. And here's the reality. If a user, 20%, when they've done studies, only 20% of a user behavior will be impacted by the information you provide them. The consequences drive 80% of the behaviors. So no matter what you tell people, like if I tell people you have to wear a badge, they're like, okay, maybe I'll start wearing a badge. But if nobody else wears a badge, they're going to say, hey, why am I standing out? I'm just going to put it away. It's a nuisance to keep my badge on. And if nobody else wears a badge or tells them to, they're going to keep their badges in their pockets at best. So anyway, awareness is only 20% of the actual solution. You have consequences which drive the other 80%. Now let's talk another science, counterterrorism. Counterterrorism has the working philosophy of left a boom, boom, and right a boom. Left a boom is essentially, and I'll go to the next slide because it depicts it a little bit better. So left a boom is what you do to stop boom being an explosion, an attack of some sort. Boom is the attack itself. Left a boom is how do you stop the attack from being realized. Right a boom is the attack has been realized. What do you do to mitigate the potential damage? So for example, boom itself, like let's say boom is a terrorist explosion. Left a boom involves like intelligence people going ahead and figuring out, okay, who might potentially launch the attack? How can I follow them? How can I potentially stop them before they get close to launching the attack and so on? Then there's another aspect of left of boom, which is like, hey, where are my likely targets and how can I harden the targets? So, for example, unfortunately, after the September 11th attacks, airports started saying, okay, now we're going to go ahead. We're going to implement better security, better screening of passengers, and so on. Whether you think it works or not is a separate issue. But either way, those are the sciences in left of boom. Boom, and let's talk about this. This is either giving the users the appropriate environment and having the use, well, actually, this is like, okay, how can we stop the attack and contain the attack as best as possible? Now, in a case of terrorism, what happens is they say, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to reinforce the airplane cockpits as an example. You know, in the case like the September 11th attacks, a lot of people don't realize this, but in the year or so leading up to the September 11th attacks, there was an independent thing going on inside the Pentagon, one of the 9/11 targets. Inside the Pentagon, they did a whole bunch of reinforcement of the facility. They strengthened it. They put blast walls in and so on, and that stopped a whole bunch of death and damage inside the Pentagon. And that's why the Pentagon was not as visual of an attack or representative of the September 11th attacks as the World Trade Center, for example. But that was a good case. Then you have the right of boom response, like, okay, an attack has happened. What do we now do? So do we first off go ahead and make sure more people don't go into harm? We have to make sure there are enough hospitals. We have to make sure first responders. We also have to put plans in place to make sure there aren't any secondary explosions going on. How do we prevent that? How do we prevent damage from secondary explosions? If people know of the Boston Marathon bombings or remember that, one of the bigger problems was there was a secondary, there were two bombs, one went off before the other, and so that happens sometimes with terrorists who say, okay, I am going to do an attack and then wait for all the first responders to come in and then do a secondary attack to even hamper the response to it and create more death, you know, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which is really the focus of terrorism, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So then it's like, okay, how do I do this? How do I then catch the perpetrators and so on? That's essentially the concept of boom. Now, each phase of boom has protection, detection, and reaction built in. Obviously, you know, even if you say, well, left of boom, that's to stop something from happening. Yes, it's to stop something from happening, but we still have to go ahead and start being proactive and saying, hey, we have bad people here. Our job is to stop bad people from doing bad things. So we got to find the bad people. We have to detect their attacks, and hopefully we mitigate the attacks before the attacks are launched. So that's the protection, detection, and reaction. With 90% attacks, and let's come back to our industry, 90% of attacks in the cybersecurity industry tend to involve the user as the point of boom. Whether it's clicking on a phishing message, whether it's opening up malware, whatever it is, when you look at every study from the Verizon data breach investigation reports to every other study that has come out, 90% of all significant attacks have targeted a user as the primary point of entry. And our goal is to establish protection, detection, and reaction for each of these phases to look at user attacks in this boom philosophy. Moving on, what I want to start people to think of is user-initiated loss. That's a term I'm trying to get people to absorb and understand. A user does not create a loss. A user initiates a loss. Your system has to allow the loss to be realized. Now, the user might go ahead and be victim to somebody's attack, but the loss, again, is not a loss until the user initiates it if we look at the user in a point of boom. So anyway, you know, as we start doing this, we have to start considering, okay, the user is in one way a canary in a coal mine, but the user is essentially just a piece of the system, a critical and pivotal piece of the system that is the focus of allowing the attacks to begin or a focus of mitigating the attacks and so on proactively. So again, you want to stop the user-initiated loss potential. You want to stop the actual loss should it be realized, and you want to mitigate the loss after the initiation of the loss as well. So let's work user-initiated loss from left to boom through to right of boom. So in left to boom, what is your goal? Your goal is to actually stop the user from being in a position to initiate the loss. And using a phishing attack, for example, this is, for example, what all these web content filters put out there. This is what your email, anti-malware filters, anti-malware servers put out there. They're all there to prevent the user from being in the position to initiate the loss. A user can never click on a phishing message if the phishing message doesn't get to the user. Again, users can't click on stuff unless you give the user stuff to click on. So again, you got to stop these attacks from reaching the users. And I'm also going to say simultaneously, we should be creating a culture. And what I mean by culture are the consequences. Again, antecedents create behaviors, behaviors create consequences, consequences go back and reinforce or harm behaviors. Now, what I mean by this is, for example, if users take equipment out, you should have a culture that has people lock up their equipment proactively. You should have an environment, a culture that stops users from theoretically talking about work outside of work. And then also look at users potentially as aiding detection. Like users can start to see vulnerabilities, and if the users can be aware and start seeing things in progress, like for example, stop a tailgater from coming in the building. I think there's a quote I first heard from Marcus Raynham. Again, you don't care that, and this was regarding getting into a hacker getting into a computer system. He's like, you don't care that a hacker gets into your system. You care what they do once they're in the system. And that's a critical point. But if you can stop the hacker from getting in the system, or you can stop a social engineer from getting in your buildings, for example, like tailgaters, that stops the attack, so you don't have to worry about what they're doing once they're in the first place. And mitigate this throughout. Now, here's another piece of the issue, and most importantly, governance. And this is the part that a lot of people in awareness and everybody else just don't get right. Governance should look at an entire process from start to finish and say, how should that process be laid out? I mentioned accounting before. Accounting basically goes ahead and says, okay, here's what we need to spend money. Here's how we need to spend money. Here's how we're laying out the process that if money is to be spent, here's the authentication that has to be. Here's the forms that have to be filled out. Here's all the equipment and everything. All of these things have to be clearly defined. So what you should be doing is you should be looking at processes in a left-to-boom philosophy from start to finish and say, how should this process be performed? So looking at it, I'm going to use the example of phishing. And I can't remember if it's later in my slides, but using the example of phishing, I'm going to go ahead and say, you know what? From a phishing perspective, I realize phishing is a problem. I'm first going to go ahead and use DMARC. I'm going to go ahead and subscribe, for example, to the anti-phishing working group blacklist and so on, and start banning, and start going ahead and filtering out harmful messages as best I can. That's number one. Number two, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have my email servers filter out bad, potential phishing messages, filter out malware, and so on. And I'm going to set that up. Then I'm going to have the user come in, and governance says, okay, now here's this. What is my user environment going to be like, my user experience? Because user experience is as important, if not more important, than awareness itself, because you want to lead the people into the right decision making. And so you're going to have a good user experience that said this, for example, this message is from outside the organization. You're then going to go ahead and give the user potential warnings, and then so on. But then I'm going to realize, you know what? A user might still click on that message. What am I going to do? From a governance perspective, I might not give my users admin privileges on their system. If I'm not giving them admin privileges on the system, they can't download a bunch of malware in general that would cause harm. Then I'm going to have web content filter that's going to stop them from going to malicious websites and give away their passwords and so on. And I'm going to look at this whole thing from a governance perspective from start to finish. But people aren't doing it that way. They're like, oh, well, we have this user. Get them not to click on stuff. That doesn't work. Look at it from a start. Now, boom. So boom is where a user is given the opportunity to initiate a loss. Then the question is, do they do it? Do they detect it? Do they prevent it? More importantly, do they sound the alarm? And remember, this boom can be from accidents, it could be from carelessness, it could be malicious, it could be because their computer was running slow and the cursor was in the wrong part of the screen and had a lag, and the user clicked. They thought they were in the right place, but the system was in a different place, and that has happened before as well. But either way, a good user can cause damage, a bad user can cause damage, even a stupid user can cause damage. And yes, despite the fact that I'm saying most of the problem is from the professionals, the reality is there are some really stupid users out there. Let's not discount that. But anyway, boom is where a user can do this. Now, the question is, have you laid out user actions? Like, what should a user do at any given point in time? So, for example, a common phishing attack is accounts payable fraud, where some attacker comes and says, hey, I am so and so from this company. You pay me money every month. I need you to change the bank account so that from now on, all my payments go to my new bank account. Now, that could be a legitimate business request, but it could also be, and more frequently, a fraud. Now, the question is, have you laid out to the user specifically what they are supposed to do? The problem with most organizations, and I realize hopefully Elmer Fudd, he's back in the news, but because of they're taking away his gun. But anyway, Elmer Fudd is the Bugs Bunny character, and he was always looking for the wascally wabbit. And he only recognized Bugs Bunny dressed as Bugs Bunny. If Bugs Bunny put on a costume or a disguise, he could not recognize Bugs Bunny. The problem is most awareness programs are essentially saying there are bad people out there that use tricks. Look out for bad people doing tricks. And the thing is, you're always creating Elmer Fudds. You're getting people, is that the hacker? Is that the wascally wabbit, as Elmer Fudd would say? Is that the wascally wabbit trying to trick me? You don't want people determining whether it's the wascally wabbit. You want people following the one right way to do it right. If somebody comes in and says, I need you to, for example, to change account payable information, you should have a process that the person says, hey, you know what? Maybe it is the right person, maybe it's not. But my process is I have to verify that what is the appropriate person to request this. I then have to confirm it with X, Y, and Z. I then have to do a separate confirmation, send out an actual physical letter, call the person up, or whatever the case is. But there should be policy specific to how people do it right, not getting people to be afraid on what can go wrong. And it sounds like a very fine line, but it's a line. Now we move on to write-a-boom. In this case, for whatever reason, a loss has been initiated, either through accident, malice, ignorance, whatever the case is. Now, your environment should expect this. Maybe they don't expect the attack, but your environment, your technical architecture should expect that a user might potentially cause harm in one way or another. What can you do to protect the environment? What are the expected harmful actions a user can take? And how do you stop and mitigate that? What can user-initiated loss look like? And what protections have you done? And a lot of people aren't doing that. So for example, let's say a person falls for the trick of the accounts payable fraud and changes this. What are you doing to verify that changes have been made? Does your system account for that happening? So for example, a user clicks on a phishing message. We expect that. Are your systems out there saying, okay, we have web content filters that stop the attack, that pick up the click. We have malware detection that stops the malware from being loaded or detects it after it is loaded and isolates the system and so on. That's writable. More important, do you go back and analyze an incident? Why did the incident occur? What caused the incident? Could we have stopped the incident from being initiated in the first place? Could we have filtered out the incident before it got to the point of a user initiating the loss? But what you can't do is you can't go back and say, oh, it's the user's fault. You might say, how did the user get in the position? Why did the user do it? But the user itself was not the cause. The system as a whole caused the loss, not the user individually. Now, the thing is, this sounds different, but safety science does this all the time. Accounting does this. Your brethren in accounting inside your organization are there. Every time there's an accounting error, they looked at why did this accounting error happen. Operations does this. If there's a loss in operations, if a factory goes down, if something slows down, if deliveries go down, depending on what your organization is, if engineering or computers go down, computer operations go down, why did the operations go down? How could we prevent it? The medical profession is infamous for this. If a patient dies in a hospital, hospitals around the world generally have weekly gatherings or monthly gatherings, whatever it is, where the doctor has to defend what happened with this patient, what could have been done differently from both the doctor's perspective as well as the system's perspective. Because again, from the doctor's perspective, you look at, well, gee, the doctor did this act which might have caused the death. But really, the doctor didn't make that one decision isolated from all other decisions. There were a lot of other pieces of information that got to the doctor. If, for example, they ask if the doctor had another piece of information, could they have done something different, and so on. So you've got to go ahead and think of yourself, if a user caused loss and the loss was either realized or not realized, perhaps, what could we have done differently? And that's cool. You learn much more this way. So anyway, consider this. And again, the concept is if 90% of incidents result from some form of user-initiated loss, shouldn't this strategy be used for all your losses as well? Thinking, okay, well, what happens? Where are my losses coming from? If like the other 10%, it's like, okay, this is where my boom was from a technology perspective. How did this from a technology perspective happen as well? So anyway, we'll take that there and just consider that. That's another presentation. Now, I realize this is a very US-centric feature, but I've already beat to death the accounting and like accounts payable example. But there's a big piece of fraud in the US, which is known as W-2 fraud, which is around tax season. And what happens is every year, at the end of the year, companies have to send their employees what's known as W-2 forms, which the employees then use for filing taxes. That's critical for, obviously, a lot of things. And it's the same thing in a lot of other countries where people pay their taxes annually and they get their annual salary information, what taxes were collected, and so on. Now, what happens in this case is in US W-2 fraud, a bad person, criminal goes ahead and usually sends a message to the HR, like some low-level HR account representative they found randomly on LinkedIn or something similar. And what they do is they send a message that says to the effect, I'm the CEO of the company. I'm traveling, so I can't do this myself, but I need you to send out an update. I need you to send out the latest W-2 information, the tax information to our new accounting firm. Here's the information. Please send it out or send it to me so I could send it to them. Now, they expect a well-meaning employee to go ahead and do, and do this. Now, you would say, who would fall for this? This happens in the U.S. about 2,000 times a year, at least that we know about, if not more frequently. Again, this is just what we know about and gets reported. But anyway, so 2,000 times a year in the U.S., this email message gets to an HR rep. So what should happen? In the first place, mail filtering should stop this message from getting to the HR rep in the first place. Also, they could tag the email as coming from outside the company, and if you tag it, at least that's a red flag for the user. Their user experience at least says, hey, wait a second, there's something suspect. Now, at the point of boom, though, what is the process for releasing this information to begin with? So I don't look at this as tax information like, oh, this is tax, it's special. I would look at this as this is PII, personally identifiable information. that should therefore be treated sensitively. And if I'm an HR person, the HR person should be sitting there saying, what is the process for sending out PII to a different person, whether it's the CEO or not? And that process might involve, it's like, hey, as an HR low-level analyst is not supposed to send it out. It might only be sent out with the, through the head of human resources. And that head of human resources has to get the approval of the general counsel, for example, to send information outside the company. So that should be a process. And now theoretically, should the HR analyst, can the head of human resources be social engineered? Can that general counsel be social engineered? The answer is possibly, but at least you're not relying upon a low-level analyst to deal with a sociopath or a highly skilled criminal, which is what you're doing. But anyway, at the point of boom, the HR person should receive the training to know what to do. They should be reinforced. And then let's assume, for example, that the HR analyst says, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I want to get promoted, so I'm going to send out this information. Or let's even assume they trick the head of HR and the general counsel. There should be warnings about attaching sensitive information to an email and sending it outside the company. And even if the people don't listen to that, there should be data leak prevention software that stops the information from actually leaving the company. So that's a way of putting together the entire process to mitigate this. It's not just the fault of the user for sending out the information and clicking on it. But again, consider the overlap. I gave you the example of tax information at the end of the year. This could be for all PII. This could be for all CEO fraud. Data leak prevention stops a variety of attacks. Filtering incoming email obviously stops multitudes of attacks. Tagging of email as external stops a variety of, it gives people different warnings and triggers. And again, warning of attachments the same way. This can stop, by stopping that problem, you can stop a wide variety of other problems. And thinking about it, think about all the overlap. Again, if we're stopping 90% of the problem, the overlap and adding the countermeasures that I mentioned should go a long way in stopping the other 10% of the, well, basically, I just beat that to death. But anyway, if you can mitigate 90% with robust countermeasures, perhaps the last 10% might also be stopped there. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people still say, Ira, you just said awareness is just a little piece of the puzzle. Maybe we just give up awareness. No, awareness is still critical, because what you need to do is the user can still stop so much damage. Users have been able to detect a variety of attacks and so on. But the other part is every countermeasure is about returning more than it costs. And people generally spend so little on their awareness program that if they have one incident, that one incident more than pays for whatever they spent on the awareness. So again, awareness is still mandatory. It's about risk management. And it's still one critical step in the whole process that needs to be addressed. You can't have that crap about the human firewall, but at least you have that about the user as a place of risk reduction. So again, this comes down to, are you throwing around random tactics or are you using a strategy? The random tactics, what I'm referring to are, well, we're going to put some anti-malware up. We're going to give some awareness training. We're going to go ahead and maybe put data leak prevention in place or so on. But people are looking at that as just random acquisitions of technology or random acquisitions of tools or awareness. Though you're throwing tactics, you need to have a comprehensive strategy in mitigating user-initiated loss. Because if you don't have that, essentially what you're again doing is you're creating your canary in the coal mine. But you're saying, you know what we need? Healthier canaries. We need healthier canaries who aren't going to die from gas. Now, let me be specific. You do need reasonably healthy canaries. You need to make sure that your canary doesn't just die of old age. Your canary doesn't die of a heart attack or whatever else. So you need healthy canaries, but basic canaries that are reasonably healthy, that they can be expected to be, to not die randomly. Because you don't want a coal mine deserted because a random canary just dropped dead. However, just making healthier canaries doesn't solve the overall problem that you need to solve. So anyway, the highlight. Now, okay, obviously, buy my current book that's available, Advanced Persistent Security. It's awesome. I do need your input, though. My next book, not available for sale just yet, is called You Can Stop Stupid, obviously based on this title. And if you want to drop me an email, go ahead and let me know which book cover you prefer, the one on the left or the one on the right, the stop sign or the other one. That is interesting because obviously I want a good book with a good cover. But if you need to get a hold of me, here's my information, and I look forward to getting your questions. Again, thank you for listening. Hopefully you're still listening now, and feel free to reach out at any time. Thanks, and thanks again to the people from B-Sides Athens, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you in person next year.